In February 1957, a county health inspector named Douglas Merriweather arrived at a farmstead in the Cumberland Gap foothills with a routine assignment: investigate reports of untreated tuberculosis. What he found instead would become one of the most suppressed case files in Tennessee public health history. The house stood at the end of a logging road that hadn't seen maintenance in decades. Merriweather's notes describe the structure as architecturally irrational. Rooms added without regard for right angles, hallways that curved back on themselves, windows facing interior walls. When he knocked, a girl no older than 14 answered. She was visibly pregnant. Behind her, in the dim kitchen, sat an elderly man the inspector estimated to be in his 70s. The girl called him grandfather. She also called him husband. Merriweather's report, filed with the Knox County Health Department and later sealed by court order, documented what he termed a multi-generational consolidation of bloodlines unprecedented in modern Appalachian settlement. The family name was Creel, and at its center was a man named Josiah Creel, a patriarch who had, over the course of 40 years, constructed a genealogical nightmare so profound that by the time authorities intervened, they could no longer determine which children belonged to which generation. Before we continue, subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. It helps us bring these buried stories back into the light. The Creel family had occupied the same 160 acres in Claiborne County since 1891, when Josiah's grandfather purchased the land from a failing timber company. By all accounts, the first two generations were unremarkable: subsistence farmers who sold ginseng and walnut lumber to survive the lean years. But when Josiah Creel inherited the property in 1917, something shifted. Church records from the Clear Fork Baptist congregation show that Josiah married a woman named Opal Hensley in June of that year. She was 16. He was 22. The marriage itself wasn't unusual for the time or region. What came after was Opal bore Josiah 7 children between 1918 and 1929. Census records list their names: Silas, Dovie, Clem, Ruthie, Harlan, Verna, and Ezra. But by 1935, Opal's name disappears from all documentation. No death certificate exists, no burial record. In the 1940 census, Josiah is listed as head of household, unmarried, living with 6 adult children and 4 juveniles whose parentage is marked only with dashes. A retired school teacher named Alma Bledsoe, who attempted to conduct truancy visits in the area during the 1940s, later told a Knoxville journalist that the Creel homestead was a place parents used to frighten children. She recalled approaching the property once and being met at the tree line by 3 men who stood silently in the road until she turned her car around. "They didn't speak," she said in a 1981 interview. "They didn't need to. You could feel wrongness in the air, like the land itself was sick." What Bledsoe couldn't have known, what wouldn't surface until Merriweather's inspection, was that by 1940, Josiah Creel had already begun the practice that would define his legacy. He had started marrying his daughters. When Douglas Merriweather was finally granted access to the Creel home's interior, he found what he described as a parody of domestic life. Furniture was arranged in concentric circles around a wood stove. Sleeping pallets lined the floors of every room. And in the kitchen, hanging on a nail beside a calendar from 1949, was a ledger. The ledger was a composition notebook with a marbled black and white cover. Inside, in careful script, someone had recorded births, deaths, and unions. Merriweather photographed several pages before the family's attorney, retained after the health department filed an emergency petition, had the evidence seized. Those photographs, however, were copied into Merriweather's personal files, which his daughter donated to a regional history archive in 2003. The entries are chilling in their bureaucratic precision. Dovie Creel, age 19, wed to Father J. Creel, April 1937. Issue: male child, stillborn. Ruthie Creel, age 17, wed to Father J. Creel, September 1938. Issue: female child, Letha, October 1939. Verna Creel, age 16, wed to Father J. Creel, June 1940. Issue: male child, Boone, March 1941. Female child, Lurleen, August 1943. The ledger continued in this manner for 18 pages. Marriages between Josiah and his daughters. Marriages between Josiah and the daughters born of those unions. And, in later entries, marriages between Josiah's sons and their own sisters or nieces. By 1950, the family tree had ceased to resemble any coherent structure. It was a closed loop, folding back on itself generation after generation. Meriwether noted that many of the children listed bore visible signs of genetic distress. A boy named Harlan Jr., age 9 in 1957, had a cleft palate so severe he could not speak intelligibly. Twin girls, approximately 6 years old, shared a cranial malformation that gave their heads an elongated, almost conical shape. Another child, gender uncertain, age unknown, was described as non-ambulatory, with severe developmental delays and possible skeletal dysplasia. But perhaps the most disturbing entry in the ledger was the last. Letha Creel, age 17, wed to grandfather J. Creel, November 1956.
Letha was the daughter of Ruthie, who was herself Josiah's daughter, which made Letha both Josiah's granddaughter and, biologically, his daughter. She was the girl who had answered the door when Meriwether arrived. She was 7 months pregnant, and she was not the only one. By March 1957, the Knox County Health Department, in coordination with the Tennessee Bureau of Vital Statistics, had compiled enough evidence to seek a court-ordered removal of all minors from the Creel homestead. The legal justification was medical neglect, though internal memos, obtained through a public records request in 1999, revealed that prosecutors were acutely aware they were dealing with something far darker. One memo, written by Assistant District Attorney Harold Tipton, states, "We are not prepared to charge incest in the conventional sense, as the familial relationships have become so tangled that assigning legal kinship is nearly impossible. Several of the children are simultaneously offspring, siblings, and cousins to one another. Genetic testing is not sufficiently advanced to clarify these connections." What followed was a quiet siege. On April 8, 1957, sheriff's deputies, accompanied by 2 social workers and a physician, arrived at the Creel property. They expected resistance. What they found instead was compliance. Silent, eerie compliance. Josiah Creel, now 72 years old, sat in a rocking chair on the sagging porch. He did not stand when the officers approached. He did not speak. When asked to produce identification, he pointed to the ledger still hanging in the kitchen. 11 children were removed that day, ranging in age from infancy to 17. All were taken to Knox County General Hospital for evaluation. The medical reports, filed under seal but partially leaked to a Memphis newspaper in 1979, make for harrowing reading. 8 of the 11 children showed signs of congenital disorders consistent with multi-generational inbreeding: microcephaly, polydactyly, heart murmurs, and profound intellectual disabilities. 3 were entirely non-verbal. One child, a boy estimated to be 12, had no documented birth and appeared in no census or school record. He existed, as one social worker put it, outside the bureaucracy of the state. Letha Creel gave birth in the hospital 6 weeks later. The infant died within 3 hours. The autopsy listed the cause as multiple congenital anomalies incompatible with life. She never returned to the homestead. In the summer of 1957, the state of Tennessee began preparing criminal charges against Josiah Creel. The initial list included statutory rape, incest, child endangerment, and unlawful cohabitation. But by August, the case had stalled. The problem was evidentiary. Tennessee law at the time defined incest strictly within first-degree kinship: parent and child, sibling and sibling. The Creel family's relationships had become so recursive that prosecutors could not definitively prove parentage without genetic testing, which was not yet admissible in Tennessee courts. Birth certificates had never been filed for most of the children. Church records had been falsified or simply omitted. The ledger, while damning, was a private document with no legal witnesses. Moreover, the children themselves could not testify. Most were incapable of coherent speech. Those who could speak had been so isolated that they lacked the linguistic framework to describe their circumstances. When a social worker asked 12-year-old Lurleen who her mother was, the girl pointed to 3 different women and said, "All of them." Josiah Creel never spoke in his own defense. In the single recorded interview conducted by a court-appointed psychiatrist, he responded to every question with silence. The psychiatrist noted that Creel displayed no affect, no remorse, and no recognition of wrongdoing. His final assessment was chilling. Subject appears to operate under a moral framework entirely divorced from societal norms. He views his actions as a form of stewardship, preservation of the family line at any cost. In November 1957, the state quietly dropped all charges. Josiah Creel was released. The children who could not be placed in foster care or institutions were remanded to the custody of adult relatives, many of whom were themselves products of the same familial collapse. The Creel homestead was condemned by the county in 1958. Josiah continued to live there, alone, until his death in 1963. He was found in the rocking chair on the porch, facing the trees. He had been dead for an estimated 3 weeks. What became of the Creel children is difficult to trace. Tennessee's adoption and foster care records from the 1950s are incomplete, and many were later destroyed in a warehouse fire, but fragments remain. A woman named Lurleen Finch, living in Chattanooga in 1984, gave an interview to a graduate student researching Appalachian kinship structures. She identified herself as a former Creel. When asked about her childhood, she said only, "We didn't know it was wrong. We didn't know there was another way." Lurleen died in 1991. She had 3 children, all of whom reportedly suffered from congenital health issues. One son, born in 1968, was institutionalized for severe cognitive disabilities. Another died in infancy. A boy removed from the homestead in 1957, identified in records only as Harlan C., spent the remainder of his life in a state facility in Nashville. He never learned to read. He never spoke a full sentence. Staff members recalled that he would spend hours arranging stones in circles, humming a tuneless melody. He died in 2001 at the age of 53. Letha Creel, the girl who answered the door, vanished from public records after 1959. Some accounts claim she moved to Kentucky and took a new name. Others suggest she never left the mountains. A woman matching her description was allegedly seen in a small Pentecostal congregation in Hancock County in the late 1970s, but no confirmation exists. And then there were the children who were never removed. In 1972, a hunter stumbled upon an abandoned cabin 2 miles from the original Creel homestead. Inside, he found the remains of 4 individuals, 3 of them juveniles. The bodies were buried in unmarked graves on the property. A coroner's inquest determined they had been dead for at least a decade, but dental records and bone analysis were inconclusive. The case was never solved. Local residents have long suspected those remains belonged to Creel children who were hidden during the 1957 intervention. Children who lived and died without ever being acknowledged by the state. In 2003, when Douglas Merriweather's daughter donated his files to the East Tennessee Historical Society, archivists discovered something his original report had not mentioned. There was a final entry in the ledger, written in different handwriting, added sometime after the 1957 intervention. It read, "The line continues. No date, no signature, just those 3 words." Researchers attempted to trace the author, but the ledger itself had gone missing by the time a formal inquiry was launched. Merriweather's daughter claimed she had included it in the donation, but the Historical Society has no record of its arrival. Some speculate it was stolen. Others believe it was deliberately removed. But in the decades since, rumors have persisted in Claiborne County of isolated families living in the deepest hollows. Families with familiar surnames. Families that do not appear in phone books or tax rolls. Families whose children are never seen in schools or churches.
In 1998, a county paramedic named Jenna Watts responded to a call for a home birth in a remote area near the Kentucky border. She later told a colleague that the family she encountered didn't look right. The mother and grandmother appeared to be the same age. The father, she said, referred to the newborn as both his son and his grandson. When Watts tried to file a birth certificate, she was told the address she provided did not exist on any county map. The baby was never registered. And in 2011, a pair of hikers exploring an abandoned logging road near Powell Mountain photographed a house that bore an unnerving resemblance to descriptions of the original Creel homestead. Hallways at odd angles, windows facing walls, rooms that seemed to have no logical entry points. When they returned with a local historian 3 weeks later, the house was gone. No foundation, no debris, just a clearing and a circle of stones. In recent years, advances in genetic genealogy have allowed researchers to trace the long-term effects of extreme inbreeding. A 2017 study published in the Journal of Medical Genetics examined isolated populations in Appalachia and identified several founder effect anomalies, rare genetic disorders that occur when a small population reproduces within itself over multiple generations. One cluster, labeled Cohort T19, displayed abnormalities consistent with what geneticists call genomic erosion, a catastrophic loss of genetic diversity resulting in increased rates of miscarriage, infant mortality, and congenital defects. The cohort's origin point was listed as Eastern Tennessee, mid-20th century. The study did not name the Creel family, but those familiar with the case immediately recognized the profile. Dr. Evelyn Marsh, a bioethicist who contributed to the study, noted in a 2019 interview, "When a family line collapses inward for multiple generations, you don't just see physical deformities, you see cognitive stagnation, immune deficiencies, and a kind of genetic memory of trauma. The descendants of such unions often carry markers of distress, even if they themselves are not directly inbred." She paused, then added, "It's as if the DNA itself remembers what was done." Marsh declined to comment on whether Cohort T19 had surviving members. Today, the land where the Creel homestead once stood is owned by a timber company based in Knoxville. The property has never been developed. No roads have been cut. The company's official reason is environmental protection. The land is too steep, too unstable, too remote. But locals tell a different story. They say the land is cursed, that nothing grows there properly. Trees twist into knots, animals avoid it, and hunters who venture too close report feelings of profound unease. Some claim to have heard voices in the trees, a low murmuring that sounds like a family in conversation. Others say they've seen lights in the woods at night, moving in formation, as if someone were carrying lanterns through rooms that no longer exist. In 2015, a group of urban explorers attempted to locate the site using GPS coordinates derived from Meriwether's 1957 report. They documented their search in a series of YouTube videos. In the final video, filmed at dusk, one of the explorers points to a shallow depression in the earth, roughly the size and shape of a house foundation. As the camera pans across the clearing, a figure appears briefly in the background, standing among the trees. It is too far away to discern features, but it does not move. The explorers did not notice it during filming. They only saw it later when reviewing the footage. The channel was deleted a month later. The explorers never explained why. In 2018, a researcher named Colin Driscoll published a limited-run genealogical volume titled Hidden Hollows: Forgotten Families of the Cumberland Plateau. The book included a chapter on the Creels. Driscoll had spent 3 years combing through archives, interviewing elderly residents and cross-referencing census records. What he found suggested that Josiah Creel's bloodline did not end with the 1957 intervention. He identified at least 6 living individuals with direct maternal or paternal links to the family.
People who had taken new surnames, moved to different counties, and built lives far from the shadow of the homestead. None agreed to be interviewed. 2 sent cease and desist letters. But Driscoll also found something else, a pattern of silence. In every community where Creel descendants had settled, there were stories of families that kept to themselves, of children who didn't attend school, of marriages that occurred without public record. The pattern was faint, but it was there. In his conclusion, Driscoll wrote, "We tend to think of genetic atrocities as historical anomalies, things that happened in the past and have been resolved through modern intervention. But isolation is not a relic of history. It is a choice. And in the hidden corners of rural America, that choice is still being made." The book sold fewer than 200 copies. It has never been reprinted. Josiah Creel died alone in 1963, his bloodline supposedly extinguished, his crimes buried beneath bureaucratic seals and lost paperwork. But the ledger's final entry lingers. The line continues. Perhaps it was a lie, a final act of defiance from a man who saw himself as a preserver of something pure. Or perhaps it was a promise. Because in the deep folds of the Cumberland Plateau, where roads end and maps grow vague, there are still places that do not welcome visitors. Still families whose names do not appear in registries. Still children born in silence, raised in shadow, and bound to bloodlines that should have ended generations ago. The Creel homestead is gone. The children are scattered or dead. The ledger is missing. But in the Holler, they say, if you listen closely on a still night, you can hear the sound of a rocking chair creaking on a porch that no longer exists. And somewhere in the dark, the counting continues.